Hello and welcome to Bright Wings, children's books to make the heart soar. I am your host, Charity Hill. The purpose of this conversation is to help mothers and fathers identify books that will liberate their children to embrace truth, goodness, and beauty. I'm so grateful to welcome Dr. Marina Warner, who is a writer of fiction, criticism, and history. Her works include novels and short stories, as well as studies of art, myths, symbols, and fairy tales. She is a distinguished fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, where she conducts research and teaches at Birkbeck College at the University of London as well. Welcome, Marina.
Hello, Charity. Thank you for asking me.
You are involved and interested in many things. I was looking at your website, and you're highly involved in such a wide variety of different interests. But you caught my attention for your work on fairy tales. About a year ago, I did a podcast on fairy tales, and I unearthed your book titled Once Upon a Time, A Short History of Fairy Tale. And in this, you ponder, Marina, where do fairy tales come from? From what historical and geographical places do they come from? And from what places in the human person they come from? And I wonder, Marina, if you would be able to tell us some more about these things, shed some light on these things, and engage us in these questions.
The origins of fairy tales are very ancient, very deep-rooted. We have mentions, for example, in Plato. They were old. He was dismissive of them. He said they were just old wives' tales and they shouldn't be listened to, because he wanted people to think of higher things than he thought fairy tales were. And so there isn't really a point that you could name. For example, if you include animal fables and animal proverbial stories in which, a wise donkey defeats a lion because he does something cleverer and, things that are rather counterintuitive. If you think about animal fables, then you're going back right to ancient India. They're very, very ancient. They're deep-rooted. They seem to me to be, you can say that they're a kind of hardwired in the human mind. The imagination produces these kinds of stories to console itself, to entertain itself. The ones we know, the really well-known ones like Red Riding Hood or Sleeping Beauty or Cinderella, they do also have a very long history. But the versions that we know were collected pretty much from the 18th century onwards. And they were collected sometimes with a desire to discover or uncover a national literature. So they come from the people and they come in the vernacular, in the local languages of the people. They're not classical or learned. You don't learn them in a university. You learn them at the knee of your granny or the knee of your nanny or the knee actually of your, sometimes of the servants are mentioned when some people began to write them down. They said they had collected them from household staff. There's an interesting tension in the history of fairy tale transmission between the unlettered peasants and the learned scholars who collected from the peasants. And that goes on throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, and it goes on to some extent to the present day.
So when I had my first child, when she was very young, there were two sort of rationally opposed reasons why I didn't want to read fairy tales to her at first. The first reason was I thought they were too sweet and fluffy and created unrealistic hopes of perfection, right? They weren't deep enough. And then the second reason I didn't think it was good to read fairy tales is actually that they're so dark and violent. And why would I tell such stories to my tender daughter? Both sides of this, I think, are interesting to think about, Marina. So are fairy tales too sweet?
On the whole, when you reach them in their more pure original state, they are not sweet. They hold out a hope that the evils they describe will be overcome. They hold out a very strong hope that the wicked, evil kings and ogres and so forth will be defeated by plucky, young, unprivileged girls and boys who use their wits rather than their might or their power. So they are compensatory, they are consolatory, they console, they compensate. And above all, they stiffen the resolve to continue, to believe, to have hope. So in a way, they are both sweet in a kind of a way and very dark, but they are not cynical. And they are
Right.
not defeatist. They are not pessimistic. And that's why a great number of really great thinkers and philosophers have liked fairy tales and recommended their reading, because they give a sense of possibility. They don't shut it down. I mean, there's a quotation from a German philosopher called André Holles, who I really like, and he said, "This is the reason the supernatural appears, to guarantee that the cruelty of existence will come to an end, or the cruelty of circumstances will come to an end."
It's so powerful. Say that again, please, Marina.
André Holles, who was a German philosopher, said, "This is the reason for the supernatural, that it guarantees that the wickedness of the world will come to an end."
And we need to hear this over and over. Like even now, I had you repeat it a second time because I needed to hear it twice. And then secondly, because in the heart of every person, there is a longing for justice. And I think we need to be reassured that we don't hope for this in vain. We need this declared to us from an early age, I think. And to grow in the strength of that the wickedness of the world will come to an end. You've kind of mentioned this. It seems that fairy tales are a kind of meditation on the problem of evil.
Yes, I think that's right. And they permutate many different kinds of evil. In fact, if you read more widely than the usual canon usually has domestic tensions between sisters, between sometimes fathers and daughters, and mothers, of course, very cruel mothers and cruel stepmothers. Sometimes they have been transformed from mothers into stepmothers. But there are even wider, there's quite a wide range of circumstances that fairy tales cover. They do think up every eventuality that might assail you, that might bring you down, and they offer hope that you might overcome it. And then, of course, there are the wonderful inventive writers like Hans Christian Andersen, and in our time, Angela Carter, and many others, actually, also in America. Many American writers have taken up fairy tales, and they offer more permutations. And I suppose what you could say is happening is that this double character, that something is being sweetened, something very dark and difficult is being sweetened, that double character makes it a way of passing on difficult and problematic situations for children and actually grown-ups to know. I mean, an example is a famous fairy tale called Donkey Skin. And in Donkey Skin, what happens is that the girl in the center of the story loses her mother at the beginning, as often happens in fairy tales. And her father promises her mother on her deathbed that he will never marry again unless he finds somebody as beautiful and as good as she is. And then when the daughter grows up, he looks at his daughter and thinks, "Oh, you're just as beautiful and good as your mother was, so I want to marry you." And the story is about how she gets away. And the important thing about the story in her getting away from her father and disobeying her father is that the story is completely on her side. So this is a very powerful story about what could happen in a family in a rather different, I mean, it's obviously kings and queens and princesses, and he wants to marry her, which is not what child abuse is about. But this is obviously a way of disguising the reality, the real experience of possible child abuse, of incest, and making it a charming story in which she gets away and it all ends happily. He realizes the wickedness of his ways and he repents and she forgives him. I mean, it's a story that it's also written, I mean, it's a story that lifts your spirits, and it's also written in a very light, flirtatious way. It's not written to be a sort of horror story.
Yes.
You do, of course, get lots of fairy tales written as horror stories. And in fact, the Grimm brothers, to some extent, write them as horror stories. And a lot of contemporary uses of fairy tale also stress the dark side. But it's not necessary. One can make them liberatory and emancipatory and comic, too.
What strikes me about fairy tales at this point in my life is something similar to what you've been saying, which is they seem to be tales told by perhaps, I mean, it's very easy for me to imagine that they're tales told by women who are worried and anxious about the different evil permutations that are possible in the life of their child. So maybe it's told by a woman who has been saying to herself, I'm sick. And what would happen if I die? What would I be afraid of for my child?
Very
And
good. I agree.
and even and so you can see that the tale of, I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's the mother who has a thimble and a spinning wheel, and she hides these itty bitty tiny gifts and gives them to the child.
Yes.
Or there's also a story in which a doll comes to life when the daughter begs the doll for her help. The mother has died, and the
Yes.
mother has given the girl a doll, and the doll provides occasionally
Yes.
for the child's welfare.
Yes.
But even, in these mother to daughter scenarios where the mother has died, but even a story such as Jack and the Beanstalk or The Brave Tailor, where the male protagonist is a little bit of a loser,
Yes.
where the mother is able to say, like, listen, my son, you're not all that you should be, but yet I tell a story in which good things happen to you anyway.
That's right, exactly. There's a tremendous emphasis in fairy tales on pluckiness and cunning and quick-wittedness. So in Jack and the Beanstalk, he's very quick-witted, Jack. And there are lots of trickster tales in which the girl is also, very courageous. And Hans Christian Andersen uses that in The Snow Queen, which is one of the great literary fairy tales, because Gerda is tremendously brave and courageous. She's not strong, or she's a girl, and in a society that when girls were, not, but she sets out to save Kai, and she does save Kai. So there's that strong adventurous spirit for both boys and girls, depending on how you select the fairy tales. For a long time, stories of plucky girls were selected against, compared to, girls were the Sleeping Beauties, the Red Riding Hoods, and the Cinderellas. The plucky, trickster, tough heroines rather faded from view, but they're coming back. I think you're very perceptive about mothers and daughters, because one of the reasons that I was attracted to writing about fairy tales is that it seemed to me to be one of the few really long traditional female arts, and that it hadn't been really investigated or explored as deeply as it should have been from that point of view. This was something that women told, and women told to women, and they told the stories about women. So it's an area of female experience. It was rather derided. There was a lot of criticism, and men were trying to. There was a sort of male authority contempt for the form in order to crush it, because it did really pass on female secrets. I had a theory about Rapunzel, which is another very famous fairy tale, in which she's imprisoned in a tower by the woman who was looking after her. It became the film Tangled.
Yes.
And she's given away by her mother, in return because of a bargain she made with the witch at the time of the child's conception. So I think that that's a story a bit about adoption, a bit about child abandonment, about not having the mother that gave birth to you, and it looks at all these different things. At one time, I even speculated that there was an undercurrent of the possible desire to not have the child. When the mother eats the herbs in the witch's garden, witches were associated, with condemned activities like love potions, but also suppression of menstruation, to do with the body, to control of the body, including women's reproduction. So if you wanted to not have a child, you went, as it were, to a witch. The witches were healers. They were medicine women. They knew what they were doing. And so I think that there's a kind of buried stratum in the story of Rapunzel, in which she goes to the witch's garden for herbs and then promises to give away her baby. I think there's a sort of one of these examples of a very concealed human scene of feelings and desires of women's lives and women's inner lives, of which we have precious few records, because until women became fully literate and able to express themselves, we have some traces, of course, in chronicles, and we have traces in ballads, singing that have been preserved. But fairy tales are the richest deposit of women's experiences before mass literacy.
Marvelous. Marina, what do you make of the fact that at the end Rapunzel has twins?
Yes, yes, that's right. That's
Like a really super abundantly fruitful
yeah, yes,
with
and
the love of the young man.
exactly. Yes, there's a redemption there. She has twins. She has a boy and a girl. So there's a kind of yes, breaking through. I don't mean redemption from sin. I mean redemption from
Of the
despair.
whole situation,
Yes,
right?
from despair. She's freed from despair. Yes.
That's so beautiful. That's such a beautiful reading. Thank you. You've really enriched me, actually. Just now. I have twins, boy girl twins. In
Oh,
fact,
lovely,
too. Yeah.
wonderful. Gosh, the sun and moon. Uh,
Yes.
Sleeping Beauty has twins too.
Oh, really?
Yes,
Oh.
yes, yes. When the Sleeping Beauty, you see that story, that's a very strange story because in terms of psychology, because there the mother-in-law, the Queen Mother, wants to kill her grandchildren. She, she when the prince brings back Sleeping Beauty from the castle and she has the twins, she's jealous. So there, the mother of the granny is jealous of the beauty, goodness, and the fertility of the younger woman. And she tries to have the babies cooked for her by the palace cook, but he takes pity and doesn't do it. This ending, this sort of sequel of the Sleeping Beauty, which is in the first version written down, doesn't usually make it into children's books because it's very gory. And in the end, the wicked queen is boiled alive in the cauldron she'd prepared for the children.
Ooh.
And it ends with a sort of little line. The prince was a bit sad. She was, after all, his mother.
That's fair.
So
Well, how true, right? Of all the dimensions, but what so marvelous the way fairy tales really insist on justice.
that's right.
Justice succeeds. Courage is what brings about justice, but also love. Love is the magic in
Yes,
so many ways that frees us
it's
from our
wonderful.
enslavement, from the enchantment, from the magical force or the oppressive person.
Yes, and love drives the adventurous heroes and heroines. They often they quest because they want to save someone, or they want to regain their love, or they want to. Sometimes they need to quest because they themselves have fallen under enchantment, and they need to be freed from it while they free others. I mean, the wonderful story, the Six Ravens, which is also another, it comes up with swans in other versions, is about a daughter who is put under an enchantment of having to keep silent, she mustn't speak, to redeem her brothers who have been changed into swans or ravens. And then she has to, sew and stitch for them shirts made of nettles or brambles or something terrifying and cruel. And she works away at these shirts. And then in, I think, the Anderson version, she throws the last shirt. She's about to be burnt at the stake because they consider her a witch. And she throws the last shirt with one sleeve missing over her last brother. And then her brothers rescue her, but one brother still has a wing instead of an arm. And I love that story. It's all about female courage under duress, their female resilience, exceptional courage under torture, and so forth.
I just noticed that I like that her brother has one wing, as if a kind of testimony, verification that his sister was right all along.
Yes. And I think the other aspect that fairy tales that speak to us now very strongly is that closeness to the world of natural, the world of natural forms, the world of trees, the world of animals of all kinds, the world of birds, even fish. The animals all speak. There are deep relationships between humans and animals in the stories. The places they take place in, as it were, ecological environments of the past. I mean, they record ways of life that we no longer enjoy or suffer from, which way you want to look at it. But they certainly remember it, and that's what's needed now. There's an absolutely accepted organic relationship between the survival of animals and the survival of the characters who are human in the stories. And also the capacity to change between animals and humans. I mean, that the constant, the goose girl has this talking horse, and whose head is cut off, but he still continues to talk and to help her after his head is cut off. The beast is, he's been transformed because of some transgression he committed in the past. He's been turned into a beast. but she loves him through his disguise. She sees through it eventually. And then her love transforms him back in a kind of almost baptism scene where her tears fall on him and transform him. I mean, these stories aren't always fixed. I mean, I'm giving versions that are well-known versions, but actually they are in constant transformation themselves. I mean, metamorphosis is something that happens in the stories, but it's also a character of the stories themselves. They're constantly metamorphosing according to the needs of the listeners, the audience's needs. And you see that very strongly now in the pattern of film adaptations. Film adaptations speak to the present. They might be set in medieval castles or 18th century castles. They may seem very remote, but they're all actually, very consciously talking to us now.
This reminds me about what you said in the beginning about how fairy tales seem to be embedded in the human mind. There are other things, structural themes that seem to be constant over time.
Let's talk for a moment about the way characters free themselves or are freed
from the oppressive magical person or force.
Sometimes characters have to do things just right. Sometimes it means doing something 3 times. Or, for example, the necessity of finding out Rumpelstiltskin's name. What is the meaning of this? And do you think it's tied to understandings of exorcism?
I think exorcism is based on the same principles, the same deep structures. And that is that language has a performative power. The words are not, sticks and stones will break my bones, but words will never hurt me, is not actually the case. And I think we've seen that understanding grow with the experience of hate speech and the fact that it's been declared against the law, because words carry some kind of power, and therefore they can be arranged and used in formulaic forms for an exorcism, but also for a magic spell. In any number of fairy tales, Open Sesame is probably the simplest of all, which rolls back the magic door. But you're completely right about Rumpelstiltskin's name, and even the great philosopher Wittgenstein recognized that this was a story about what words can do and how naming is crucial to name correctly, to name according to conventional agreements, a consensus of what something means. And to name that then means something can happen, a dynamic can take place, an explosion of power takes place, and that's what happens to Rumpelstiltskin. He's named, and he explodes with rage. In many religions, there is a kind of ineffable aura around the Godhead. The Godhead cannot be named, cannot be seen. You must bow your head, close your eyes, in case you glimpse the Godhead, and that sort of invisibility is because the opposite has power. And so you asked about exorcism. Well, the way of characters in fairy tales are subject to enchantments. You're completely right. They have to observe precise rules, and they often have to collect objects or use objects in the correct way, in the correct order. There's an element of explanatory element to do with the telling of the stories themselves. The groups and clusters of 3 or 9 or 6, which often occur, probably arise from the need of the storyteller to remember the story. It helps structure it. But the deeper reason is the reason that words that magic depends on verbal formulae. And actually, in quite a lot of verbal formulae that are powerful magic, they don't have an actual meaning, like riddle me ree. The word Rumpelstiltskin itself. That's quite connected to the dark arts. I mean, when people imagine how demons speak, they usually speak gobbledygook. So the world of magic is a powerful world where words have power, especially words that somehow don't quite have meaning. They kind of exceed meaning. They go beyond what we can control as meaning. And I think they probably do open up. I mean, children delight in this kind of nonsense that you get in nonsense rhymes and fairy tales. And children really love those refrains. Fee, fi, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. The fee, fi, fo, fum is especially appealing to children.
Often at the darkest point in the fairy tale is when the great reversal happens. Is it Tolkien or is it C.S. Lewis who uses the expression eucatastrophe, the good catastrophe?
Yes.
The inbreaking of the power of goodness.
I think it's Tolkien.
It's Tolkien.
Yes, I think so. It takes a long time for Tolkien's eucatastrophe to happen in Lord of the Rings.
It sure does. He's not sure he's gotten to the darkest point yet, and then yet, I think, before he provides the catastrophe.
Yes, no, I think that's actually a bit of a tendency in the present day because of the difficulties of our current times. J.K. Rowling, for example, began in a lighter mood, actually. And he got the Hogwarts and, the whole Harry Potter sequence got darker and darker. And Voldemort, became more and more powerful and sinister, and the struggle against him more and more deathly. And I think that, there's been a general tendency for the fairy tale retellings or the uses of the material to promise eucatastrophe and to be trying to move towards it. But in the meantime, actually plunging us into some very nightmarish places. That's not quite the spirit of fairy tale as I see it. This is more epic. It's apocalyptic epic rather than actual fairy tale. The fairy tale needs to be dancing. It needs to have a kind of sense of lightness. And I think, even though, as I said before, quite a lot of them are dark. When the Grimm brothers' stories were published in English in 1819 for the first time, quite soon after the German edition, the Grimm brothers were astonished because the English edition presented them as comic tales. And they did that by putting illustrations, including illustrations by George Cruikshank, who was a cartoonist. And his cartoon drawings for the first edition are simply delightful. They're impish, they're mischievous. They're full of kind of little jokes. When the hero is flying on the back of a fox, the fox sticks out its tail and like a kind of airplane, and you see the little hero sort of crouching on the fox's tail. It's funny, and and the Grimm brothers themselves were astonished that their stories, which they had collected as scholars, looking for the authentic voice of the German folk people. They were astonished that these stories could be presented as light entertainment. But that was a tradition that then continued, but that tradition has weakened. But in a sense, I feel that for children, they need to remain light entertainment, not be too difficult.
So tell us, why do you think that fairy tales end happily?
That's definitely part of the absolutely intrinsic part of the promise. And it's very important that they give that release to the listener or to the reader, that release from the oppressions and from the hurt, that release from the disarray and the whole disruption of, that the mother should be restored, that the justice, as you said, justice should be seen to be done, that the evil should be overcome. The happy ending is one of the defining principles of the fairy tale, actually, I think. There are other defining principles and this is related to the happy ending, because the happy ending relies on us being confident that the teller of the story knows what is true. This teller of the story isn't making something up on the spur of the moment now. The teller of the story is relaying something that is very old knowledge. Once upon a time, a long time ago. And this story has come down, through the centuries because people have believed it and know that it's right and it's true. And that performance of authenticity to do with the voice in the fairy tale, the old wife's voice or the old nanny's voice, the voice of Mother Goose, that's a kind of promise that this is the voice of experience. So when the ending comes, when the fairies are good and have their way and bring justice back and bring harmony and calm and joy, and everybody dances at the wedding, that ending can be believed. Of course, this belief is a double-layered belief, because we don't know what children believe exactly, but you and I know that we don't believe it. So we believe in a literary sense. We believe as readers and audience. We believe in the performance and the true, genuine spirit of the performance and the heart of this performance being sincere. But we know that in the real world, things go on not being like that. But we return from the fairy tale, from the story, with a little bit more courage.
It also occurred to me, Marina, that perhaps this ending is, as you say, a word of power, a performative word, a word of prayer or enchantment of its own kind. The recitation that things will be well indeed at the end is a kind of making it so. And it's a kind of enactment of hope.
Yes,
they will all live happily ever after.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's a complicated thing, because there is. I mean, when I was a younger woman, and I read fairy tales to my son, I never ended with the marriage, because I wasn't married at the time, and I felt that this was a false happy ending. There was always a happy ending, but it wasn't necessarily a marriage. so I kind of adjusted it. But yes, you're right. I mean, there is a famous prayer by Julian of Norwich: all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. And you're right, that is a prayer. That is the bargain with fate that the fairy tale is making. We will continue to hope. We have this vision that justice will return, and we will continue to hope. And by knowing these things, knowing these difficult things, these dark troubles, we might be able to pass through them to the other side.
Marina, Dr. Marina Warner, thank you so much for this conversation. It's really been beautiful and interesting. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have.
Thank you very much, Charity. Thank you.
For those of you who want to become more acquainted with Dr. Marina Warner's ideas, I have attached a link in the show notes to her book, Once Upon a Time, A Short History of Fairy Tale. Also in the show notes, I included a link to a list of fairy tales just for you. So in that link, you will find a list of some of the most radiant, lovely fairy tales. Most of them are picture books, but I'm including a couple which are novel-length retellings of fairy tales. In your adventures, may the eucatastrophe befall you.